Hey, morning, everybody. A couple quick announcements as always. First, tomorrow you do have a pre-lab quiz on Brightspace to do before lab class. So that is due tomorrow. Tomorrow's lab we're going to be doing on ecological succession. Anybody happen to remember what ecological succession is, as we talked about it last lecture? What's ecological succession? Yeah, so if you have a disturbance or it's just a series of then changes in the community structure, but also the ecosystem, the area then around there, as things kind of go over time. So a series of changes. So that's what we're going to be doing a lab on, taking a little bit closer look at that starting to in lab class tomorrow. And so I'll talk more about that one. So that's tomorrow, that's Tuesday. You have a pre-lab quiz associated with that lab. You also are going to have another Brightspace lecture quiz on Wednesday. So that's what we've got this particular week then. Tomorrow, by the way, tomorrow's lab, I am also going to talk a little bit about some additional statistics stuff. And we're going to talk about your posters over your project. So there is several things also we're going to be talking about tomorrow as we go through that particular lab. All right, as for today, we're going to start talking a little bit more about ecology. But we're going to start focusing in then on energy as it relates to communities and ecosystems and nutrients and ecosystems. So what we're going to be really doing here is we're kind of transitioning. This lecture set's going to be transitioning from community ecology to also now encompass a little bit of ecosystem ecology. So now we're going to be talking about community dynamics still. And typically when we're talking about energy flow and nutrient cycling, we're talking about what eats what. So feeding relationships are what are called trophic levels. But we're also going to be talking a little bit about things where the organisms are interacting with their environment then as well to get some of their nutrients sometimes or energy sometimes then too. And I am going to discuss this in the concept. I'm using the title up here on purpose. It's energy flow through an ecosystem. Energy comes into ecosystems and then flows back out. So energy goes in and out of areas. Whereas I am also then consciously using the term nutrient cycling or recycling. Chemical nutrients are constantly being recycled and used over and over and over within community structures and ecosystems then as well. So it's energy flow, but nutrient cycling is what we're going to be talking a little bit about here. So really, this type of ecology is going to focus on energy transformations of energy, but also transformations of chemical matter within a particular area, within an ecosystem then. And we're going to be tracking nutrients, chemicals, energy flow or cycling through these ecosystems. When we're doing this, we're going to keep in mind a few different things like the law of thermodynamics. So the law of physics and chemistry still apply to living organisms and to these ecosystems we're going to be describing. So when we talk about this, law of thermodynamics are going to come into play occasionally. First law of thermodynamics is that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. So you have energy is a set amount. There's a set amount of energy. We're not going to get new energy. We're not going to lose that energy, but we can transform the energy from one type of energy into another. What do I mean by transforming energy? How do you transform energy, or what are some of the different energy types? Yeah. is really what we're talking about is kinetic versus potential energy transformations is usually what I'm going to be talking about what we're going to be talking about whenever we're going through some of this thing. Closely related to the first law of thermodynamics is also that the law of conservation of mass. It states that matter cannot be created or destroyed as well. Then. So this will come up a little bit as we talk about, again, energy flow through ecosystems versus nutrient cycling through ecosystems. Another thing that's going to come up a lot is then also not just the first law of thermodynamics, but also the second law of thermodynamics. This is where every exchange of energy increases the entropy or the disorder of the universe then. Basically, what this is describing in the context, especially of biological systems, is that energy transformations are not completely 100% efficient. And some energy is always going to get lost from the system, say, and we might consider a living organism a system, to its surroundings as heat. Then. So there's always going to be no chemical reactions are 100% efficient, and there's always going to be heat loss from those. And that's going to be heat energy. Energy in the form of heat is getting lost from the organisms into its surroundings in some way. So that's always going to be happening in the background while we're talking about, again, energy flow or nutrient cycling. Heat loss is always going to be happening from living organisms to their surrounding environment. And just another example of the second law of thermodynamics, and something that might come up a few times, is something like diffusion. What's diffusion? Diffusion happens because of the second law of thermodynamics. But what is diffusion? I have to start calling on names.
Movement from like high concentration to low concentration.
So diffusion is where particles, substrates, they move from high areas of high concentration to areas of low concentration. So here I might have little circles here or some particular substrate. If they are clustered together, they're highly concentrated. They're typically then going to spread apart in solution until they are much more spread apart and that at a lower concentration then as well. So they're moving from high and they spread out so that they're at a lower concentration. And that's that's typically what happens if, say, you dissolve, say, salt into water or anything like that then as well. You get that salt crystal, that's a highly ordered, compact structure. So the salt's highly concentrated. You put that salt crystal into water, it breaks the salt apart, and then the salt will spread out so that it's equally or homogeneously mixed within the water solution. And it does so by the process of diffusion. That process, though, is a spontaneous process, and it turns off when that happens, when something moves from high to low concentration, it also gives off some heat energy when it does that, because it's a spontaneous process. It wants to happen, and that heat increases also the entropy of the disorder. And again, when you're just moving from a high concentration to a low, that's an increase in entropy as well. Questions about that? All right, does new energy enter in? So we're talking about energy flow and nuclear cycling. Does new energy enter in to Earth's ecosystems? How does new energy enter into Earth's ecosystems, if it does or does it not? Huh? Sunlight. Sun hits you, what's it feel like? Sunlight, you're sitting in the sunlight, what's probably usually gonna feel like? Pretty warm, that's because there's energy associated with that. Heat energy, kinetic energy. And so when the sunlight comes into Earth, you got the sun, let's just draw myself a nice happy little sun. And that sunlight comes into Earth, but that brings energy in. So energy is constantly coming in from the sun to Earth's ecosystems. Does energy exit Earth in any way? First off, does all the sunlight just get absorbed by Earth and just stay here? No, remember, some of that sunlight hits in the Earth's atmosphere, but then it gets reflected right back off. So you do get some reflected light. That's not really what I'm talking about here, but that happens. Earth's not a black hole. Okay. But how would energy exit? I've actually already told you. And we've only talked to really about one other type of energy specifically.
Heat given off.
Yep. You're going to have heat being radiating out back to space. Remember, sunlight is warm. When sunlight comes in, it warms whatever it hits. So if none of that energy was exiting, Earth would just keep getting hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter and hotter until it would burn into a crisp. Okay, instead, what happens is, remember, some of that heat energy from Earth is constantly radiating out back into space then as well. So energy flows in, typically in the form of sunlight, and it exits out as then heat energy. So again, this is what I mean by energy flow. The energy is coming in, energy is also going out. So it's coming in sunlight, it's going out as heat. And that is by and large how we're going to also talk about this occurring in communities and ecosystems. Typically, most energy comes into ecosystems and living organisms as sunlight ultimately, and then exits out as heat lost to the surroundings. So just like with Earth, that's also going to be the same in communities and biological systems then as well. Questions about that? We're going to talk about that more specifically. Now, I said energy flow, but remember, I also said chemical cycling. Do new chemicals enter into Earth's ecosystems? Can you think of new chemicals constantly coming into Earth? You might have an occasional, say, asteroid or meteorite come in. Giant explosion. No. But no, not really. I mean, and then also you get a few little bit of nutrients. Sometimes you lose some of the atmosphere of Earth out into space. You get a tiny bit of chemicals coming in, you get a tiny bit of chemicals exiting, but not in any kind of substantial amount. So there's not a lot, not hardly any new chemicals entering into Earth's ecosystem. So there's not many new chemicals exiting out. So do chemicals exit? No, not really as well. But remember, that means we kind of have a set amount of chemical / matter. Only so much, whatever is already on Earth. That's pretty much what we're looking at here. And again, what that means is typically we do nutrient or chemical cycling. We're not going to have so much flow of chemicals in and out of Earth as we recycle or cycle the chemicals through Earth and Earth's ecosystems then. All right. And we're going to talk a little bit about both that energy flow and chemical cycling. You're going to get maybe a little bit sick of me showing this particular diagram. We're going to go through this several different times. But this diagram is one that does a good job of just giving a broad overview of how flow of energy through ecosystems, but also the chemical cycling through ecosystems. So energy is going to come in as sunlight. That sunlight is going to be fixed by primary producers. We usually think of these as photosynthetic organisms, but there's some other types that are involved as primary producers. We'll talk a little bit about that. Those primary producers, they harvest light energy and convert it into chemical, store it up in chemical forms. Those are then eaten by things like primary consumers, which are eaten by secondary consumers, which are eaten by tertiary consumers. And as things eat this, the primary producers harvest the light energy, but then that energy gets passed on to whatever eats them, or then whatever eats them. So we see the energy going from primary producers to primary consumers to secondary consumers to tertiary consumers. And so not only is the energy being passed, but also the chemicals then as well as we go between these. Everything at some point dies. Detritus is dead organic matter. Everything dies at some point. And then there are what are called detritivores or decomposers that will eat the dead organic matter. But sometimes all of this stuff also just releases chemical nutrients into things like soil or water. And those chemical nutrients can get picked up by the primary producers and recycled. So we set up here is, again, if you're looking at this, we set up recycling of nutrients. Remember, this blue is the chemical cycling. You can see that's the only thing that forms a circle in the end, gets recycled. The energy coming in is sunlight, but where is the energy getting lost at all levels? Heat. So there's also energy loss at all levels that were being talked about as heat energy then. So again, some of the energy is lost by heat as primary producers, from heat from primary consumers, from the other types of consumers, heat from the decomposers. So we're going to talk in detail more about this one. But again, the idea is that we've got chemical cycling, but energy flow in and then out. The energy doesn't get recycled. Questions about that? All right, here we're really going to be talking about energy process. Anytime we're talking about energy processing, we're also talking about the metabolism of living organisms. And it turns out different kinds of organisms have different metabolic strategies. So there's different organisms fall into what are called different metabolic classes, where they process energy and chemicals in different ways. Now, most types of living organisms, their metabolism can be characterized by two prefixes in front of the word troph. Troph is just Latin for to nourish or to eat. Okay, so whenever I say that thing like trophic levels, I'm just talking about what eats what. Okay, that's really what we're talking about there. But here, when we're talking about the metabolism of organisms, we're really usually talking about what source of energy do they ultimately use? And then we also focus a lot on what is their carbon source. Because remember, we're organic life, we're carbon-based life. So carbon is really, really important for building up an organism. So for each prefix, there's two prefixes. The first prefix describes what is their energy source. The second prefix describes what is their major source of carbon. Then what kind of molecules they use as a carbon source. And for each one of those, there's actually only two possible prefixes. So I'm going to talk a little bit about energy source first, but then carbon source. So if we're looking at that first prefix, there's two things I can put into spot number one. Organisms can either be a chemotroph at that first spot, or they can be a phototroph at that first spot. And that first spot, well, again, it describes what their energy source is. Where does the organism get its energy from? In the case of chemotrophs, they get their energy from processing chemical nutrients. And what do I mean by chemical nutrients? Well, it could be just about any type of matter. Could be a sugar molecule, could be an amino acid that they're eating, could even sometimes be water in the case of some types of organisms. Well, it could also even be things like hydrogen sulfide or hydrogen gas in other types of organisms, but they're going to get their energy from some type of chemical or chemical reaction. So that's one of the possibilities. If they're a phototroph, where do you guys think they get their energy from? Sunlight then. Photo for photon, sunlight, in essence, light energy. So again, if I go back to my prefixes here, in this first spot, you can either put chemo in the first spot, or you can put photo in the first spot. There's two possibilities, but both of these describe then at that first position, what is their energy source? Do they get their energy from processing chemicals? Do they get their energy from harvesting sunlight? The second prefix again describes then where does the organism get its carbon from? Remember, there's two possibilities here. You can be a heterotroph or you can be a autotroph. Heterotrophs, they get their carbon from organic chemicals, carbon-based organic molecules. And some examples of that might be a sugar, like this is glucose here. It could be an amino acid, for instance, but they're going to get their carbon from, in essence, pre-made organic chemicals. Autotrophs are going to get their carbon from carbon dioxide gas. And what an autotroph does is it takes CO2 gas and then it uses that as a carbon source to build macromolecule carbon molecules. What do I mean by macromolecules? What are the macromolecules in living organisms?
Carbs,
Carbohydrates, proteins.
starches,
That's carbohydrates, sugars, lipids, and nucleic acids. So the DNA and RNA. So they take that CO2 and they use it to build things like amino acids that then they use to build proteins. They use that CO2, they convert it as a carbon source and modify it into things like sugars that then they use to build starches. Or they use it to build nucleotides that they then put together into DNA and RNA, the nucleic acids. Okay, so that's what they're going to do with this. But ultimately, their carbon source is always carbon dioxide. By the way, carbon dioxide is technically not an organic molecule. I know it has a carbon in it, but these are reduced carbon molecules. And this is more of an oxidized form of carbon. Okay, what do I mean by reduced carbon? What's reduction? You got a lot of extra electrons on it. Okay. Okay, now with these metabolic classes, you again could put either heterotroph or autotroph into this second blank. But now I can mix and match these prefixes into different possible metabolic classes. And so I can have a chemo heterotroph, but I can also have a chemo autotroph. I can have photoheterotrophs, but I can also have photoautotrophs. So what we can do is we can mix and match these into different metabolic classes. So for instance, some organisms are what are called chemoheterotrophs. And this includes all animals, all fungi, some protist species, and some prokaryotic species, some bacterial and archaeal species fall into this chemoheterotrophic category. But again, chemo means what? What does that first prefix mean? It uses chemicals as a source of energy. And then the hetero means what? It gets its carbon from organic carbon molecules. In the case of a chemoheterotroph, they eat reduced organic carbon molecules, things like sugars, fats, proteins, and they use those organic carbon molecules as a source of both energy and carbon then. So some of the organic carbon molecules they eat is a source of carbon to build up structures of the cells. But some of the reduced organic carbon that they eat gets broken down as an energy source then as well. By the way, we typically also refer to anything that is heterotrophic is also going to be a consumer, something we're going to talk about more about here in just a second. All right, questions about that so far? So we're going to go through the other classes. There's 3 other classes in addition to chemoheterotroph. We're going to go through them just like this. Next class is, again, photoautotroph. Photo means they get their energy from light. So they use light as a source of energy. Autotroph means they get their carbon from carbon dioxide. Photoautotrophs include all plants, some protist species like the algae, and some types of prokaryotic species. And what these guys are doing is they obtain energy from sunlight. And then they use that energy as a way to, in what is called organic carbon synthesis. They will take inorganic carbon, carbon dioxide gas. They use the energy that they harvested from sunlight to then convert that into organic carbon like sugars. And again, this is really where we're talking about this process right here, up and down. Both of these are really talking about photosynthesis, typically then. This right here, this first part is the light reactions of photosynthesis. This is the light independent reactions, or does anybody remember what this process right here of taking carbon dioxide gas and convert it into organic carbons? Sometimes it's called the dark reactions or the light independent reactions, but there's actually a more technical correct name for it. Now, photosynthesis is broken up into the light reactions. Both of these are part of photosynthesis, but typically we break it up into what is called the light reactions and then the light independent reactions. This right here is the light reactions. This part right here, this first part, the light independent reactions is this part. And there's a particular name for this cycle. Oops. Oh my God, I can't. Oops, I really can't read today. Calvin Benson cycle. Questions about that? All right, next metabolic class is what are called photoheterotrophs. Again, photo still means they're going to get their energy from light. But they're also going to be heterotrophic, and that means they're going to get their carbon from organic carbon molecules. Only certain species of prokaryotes fall into this category. So this is actually a prokaryotic only category. There are pretty much no eukaryotes that usually follow this metabolic strategy. I say no, I should probably say never. But anyways, so for instance, this is a bacterium species called Rhodospirillum rubrum, and it's an example of a photoheterotroph. What it can do is it contain energy from light, but then it will actually also eat things like carbon, organic carbon molecules, as then an organic to build up its own organic carbon molecules as well. Then, so this is a little bit more of an unusual strategy. Most of the time when we're talking about four species, they're going to be chemoheterotrophs or photoautotrophs for the most part. This one's a little bit more of a rarer, but certain prokaryotic species will fall into this category. Next and final fourth category for metabolic classes is chemoautotrophs. And again, chemo just means it gets its energy from chemicals. But in this case, many chemoautotrophs, they consume inorganic chemicals like hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen gas, ammonia, iron, so inorganic molecules as a source of energy. But then they are also autotrophic, and so they're going to use carbon dioxide as a source of carbon. These guys, these obtain energy from reduced inorganic molecules, okay. And they use that to then that energy to fix carbon dioxide gas and convert it into organic carbon molecules. By the way, both the photoautotrophs, oh, sorry, Thomas. Yep, it'd be exactly that, actually. So where do you find, that's a good actually question. So where do you typically find chemoautotrophs? You typically find them in areas like, yes, deep sea hydrothermal vents. You typically find chemoautotrophs in a lot of ecosystems where light is not present. And I was actually just about to get to that. Autotrophs is something we're going to talk about here next. But an autotroph equals a producer species. So we're going to talk about more about consumers versus producers here. But autotrophs always equal producers, and that's if we're talking about either photoautotrophs, but also chemoautotrophs. Typically in areas with sunlight, most producers are photoautotrophs. But there are several ecosystems that take place in the absence of light. In areas without light, then the main producers are the chemoautotrophs. And again, this could be down, there's entire areas of the ocean that are called the abyssal zone of the ocean. If you look at most of the open ocean away from the shoreline, where sunlight can't get down that deep, most of the open ocean floor is completely bare, hardly anything there. Occasionally near deep sea hydrothermal vents, you get these warmer ocean water, but you also get these deep sea hydrothermal vents. They're kind of like miniature, or they're called black smokers. They're constantly erupting, but they turn out a lot of mineral nutrients. Things like, say, for instance, hydrogen sulfide. So you got a lot of chemoautotrophs that live in that area, but then you get a lot of animals and other stuff that feed on chemoautotrophs. Okay, so you get these clusters of life around these deep sea hydrothermal vents then. Questions about that? You also get a lot of chemoautotrophs and deep in the soil down away from light sources as well. All right. All right, some things you guys should know, and I'm not gonna, I feel like I'm going a little slow today, but again, you should always keep in mind the things like the first versus the second law of thermodynamics. You always have to keep in mind, where does most energy come from in the ecosystems? Usually, unless I say otherwise, we're going to be talking about photoautotrophs being the primary producers and sunlight coming in. What allows that energy to enter into biological systems? Again, the sunlight by itself is not going to enter into biological systems unless, and this is what we're going to talk about, primary producers have to absorb or harvest the light energy. Okay. And then what we're going to focus in here as we go through today, the rest of today's lecture, tomorrow's lecture, we're going to also then focus on how does energy flow through that biological systems, but also how does energy lost? How is energy lost again? Heat. Energy. Good. All right, so like I said, you're going to get sick of me doing this one. Energy. Nutrients, they pass from primary producers to primary consumers, the herbivores. This then is passed to secondary consumers, carnivores, to tertiary consumers. These are carnivores that eat and feed on other carnivores, and sometimes even all the way up to quaternary consumers, although that's usually the limit on trophic levels, is quaternary consumers then. When we talk a little bit about this one, which ones again are the autotrophs? On my diagram, which one of these guys is a autotroph? Producers are always autotrophs. And then what are consumers? They're the heterotrophs. So any heterotroph is also a consumer. Remember, we can have primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers. And then even also things like decomposers over here are also consumers then. Now, what we're going to do is just kind of visit energy flow and nutrient cycling through these things. We're going to start off by taking a closer look then at the primary producers. And what exactly do I mean by primary production? Primary production, this is the amount of energy that's converted to chemical energy by autotrophs. So again, I'm just emphasizing it. Autotrophs are the producers, whether or not we're talking about photoautotrophs or also though chemoautotrophs. In most contexts, most ecosystems, we're going to talk about the main producers are the photoautotrophs. But again, there are certain types of environments like the down bottom dark parts of the ocean or buried deep into soil where the main producers are chemoautotrophs then as well. Typically, though, we're going to talk about photoautotrophs and therefore also what is called photosynthesis. Remember, photoautotrophs, those are ones that are doing photosynthesis. These guys right here. And what that often means then is the photosynthetic production. How much photosynthesis gets done is then also what is referred to as the spending limit of an ecosystem's budget. Because remember, what's being happened here is the photosynthesis is the production part. And the production is the amount of energy, in this case, it's sunlight when we're talking about photoautotrophs. The amount of sunlight energy that is harvested by those producers, by those autotrophs, but then they use energy is used to fix CO2 gas into organic carbon molecules like sugars. So when they're harvesting that light energy, they're using that energy of light to process carbon dioxide so that it can be converted. It takes energy to convert that carbon dioxide into eventually what's a sugar like glucose, say for instance, C6H12O6. But they're converting it into that, but that takes energy to do that process. But that is fixing the sunlight energy, which is a form of heat or kinetic energy, into potential chemical energy. It's an energy transformation. So that's why I brought up the first law of thermodynamics earlier. So they're converting one form of energy into potential chemical energy. Questions about that? But how much of that gets fixed or converted? That's the production step. How much energy is harvested and converted into the chemical energy? That's the production step. And that's the only form of energy that makes it into the biological ecosystem. The total primary production is known as the ecosystem's gross primary production. So we're going to just a few business terms here. But then the net primary production is that gross primary production minus energy, any energy that's used by the primary producers for things like, say, cellular respiration, or any energy that's lost to the surroundings as heat. So there's always going to be some of that energy gets used up directly by the organism for its growth. But some of the energy is always constantly be lost as heat out to the surroundings then as well. And it's only the net primary production that then becomes available to consumers that might eat a producer. Think of it as like this. Again, it's a business terms. The gross primary production is like the total amount of profit that is made by a company, or in this case, the total amount of energy harvested by the producers. But remember, with businesses, they still have to pay their workers. They have to pay for the supplies to make their product, whatever it is, and things like that. So some of that profit has to then get used back up to support the business. So not all of it's available as actual revenue, for instance. Questions about that? With the plants or the producers, some of the energy they got harvested has to be used to keep their biochemical activities running. So the respiration, energy processing. And only the stuff that goes into the converting into biomass, the physical parts of the plant, then is left to a consumer to eat. Net primary production. Certain areas of certain ecosystems have higher primary production than others. So for things like tropical rainforests, estuary, anybody know what an estuary is? Yeah.
Body of salt water.
Coral reefs. These are amongst the most productive ecosystems per unit of area. So what I have here is, this is just a little graph of the Earth. This is net primary production levels. So this is the amount of carbon fixed per year, in essence. But you can see certain areas like the Amazon rainforest or even the Great Barrier Reef over here off of Australia, those have the highest primary production per unit of area. That being said, marine ecosystems, just the open ocean, are relatively unproductive per area, but they contribute more to the global net primary production. Why? If they don't have a lot of production per area, why are they going to be more net primary production on a global scale? Because there's just a lot of ocean. Remember, 70% of the Earth's surface is the ocean. So while it's not very productive per unit of area, there's so much area that is still really important for total amount of production. Primary production in aquatic ecosystems. Light and nutrients control primary production within aquatic ecosystems. So light availability, nutrient availability are the limiting factors on primary production in aquatic ecosystems. So for instance, the depth of the body of water affects primary production in oceans or lakes. Certain colors of light or certain wavelengths of light. If you ever noticed, reds wavelengths of light are about 700 to 800 nanometers in wavelength. So if you ever see red, the light that looks red, it has a wavelength of 700 to 800 nanometers. Blue light is over here about 475 nanometers, for instance. Green light's about 550, 540. Okay, so that's what we're seeing here. But it turns out light interacts differently with water. Light really likes to absorb red lights. So red light barely makes it even a few meters into water. You guys ever wondered why water looks blue? Why does water look blue? It turns out the wavelength of light that water absorbs the least is blue. So water interacts with blue light the least. That's why it's going deeper than the other wavelengths of light, the other colors of light. So what that means is it's not absorbing blue light, and instead the blue light either gets transmitted through or reflected back. So water doesn't absorb blue light, so that's the light color we see coming off of it. And that's why water looks blue. For instance, it's not absorbing the blue light, that's what's being reflected back off to our eyes. Same thing with why do leaves look green? All the light colors hit the leaves, but the green light is absorbed the least by a leaf. So instead it hits the leaf and then it bounces off, and we see the green light being reflected or bouncing off the leaf then, for instance. Does that make sense? Okay. So water doesn't like to interact with blue light very well, and blue light will go down deeper than the other wavelengths. But that means different types of photosynthetic organisms, they really like to live at the top. That's where the most light is available and all the wavelengths of light are available. But some organisms that live more in the deeper parts of, say, ocean or really deep lakes, they're actually specialized to absorbing blue light pigments, because that's the only light wavelength available down at those deeper depths, for instance. Then. Shading or just depth can be a big problem in aquatic ecosystems to get light availability to do photosynthesis. Nutrients are often also limiting in aquatic environments. So in aquatic environments, nutrients limit primary production even more so than light. And it's just because, well, there's not a lot of nutrients, chemical nutrients dissolved in the water. What's called a limiting nutrient, this is the element that must be added to an area for production to increase. Okay, so if there's not enough of a particular nutrient in a ecosystem, it limits the primary production. So for instance, limiting nutrients in nitrogen, iron, and phosphorus are often limit marine production, whereas sulfur tends to be limiting in freshwater. Okay, so not enough of those nutrients. If we add those in, this is my last thing for today, I think. Yep, I'm over. Okay, if we add in those nutrients, so for instance, if there was farm runoff from fertilizer, ammonium runoff, then what you get is rapid increases in phytoplankton density. So this is basically, farmers start using fertilizer in their fields in the farm, and they go from having almost no phytoplankton in the water to then the fertilizer runoff into the ocean adds in a bunch of nitrogen, which was a limiting nutrient before. Then you get these explosion or rapid increase in phytoplanktons, what's called algal blooms, then for instance. Okay, well, I'll pick back up with that on Wednesday though.